Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. Research is something that I particularly enjoy for me it's one of the most enjoyable aspects of writing. Um, for my Enzo series, for example, I travel all around France. It gives me an opportunity to go to places I might not otherwise have been to. For my China series, now that is something that took me to the other side of the world, to a really alien land where the culture and the history and the language were so different from anything else I had known. Now, you might ask why China? Now, the first time I went to China was at the beginning of the 1980s. I went there on a day trip from Hong Kong where I was researching another book. And it was like I'd landed in another planet. I was totally blown away. It was extraordinarily different. I had no concept of what China might be like until I went there. And I knew immediately that I wanted to write about it because it was such an extraordinary experience. And I went away and I read a lot of books and I learned about the history and the culture and the politics. And a number of years later I went back specifically to search for a story. That was 1991. I went to Beijing. It was my first trip to Beijing. Now, I didn't find the story on that trip, but it was my introduction to a city that I have since come to love. An amazing, extraordinary, huge place full of the most outstandingly innovative and interesting people. It took me really another 5 years before I came up with the idea for the first of my China thrillers. Now, this was an idea that involved an extraordinary amount of research because I had chosen to write about A, the Chinese police, about which I knew nothing, B, pathology. One of my main characters was going to be a pathologist. I knew nothing about pathology. And C, the theme of the book was genetically modified food. And, I'm no expert on genetics, so I'd set myself a huge task of research. And I approached that by finding myself experts who might advise me. And I was reasonably quickly successful in finding myself an advisor on genetics and on pathology. The Chinese police was another matter altogether. Now, that was a really tricky one. At that time, this would be 97 thereabouts. The internet was really just coming into its own. There was nothing on the internet about the Chinese police. There were no books on the subject. But I was very fortunate to get an introduction to an American criminologist called Dr. Richard Ward, who during the 90s had effectively trained the top 500 Chinese police officers in the latest Western policing techniques. And I approached him and asked if he would help, and he said sure, but perhaps we should meet first. So we did, in Paris. We had dinner one night, he and his wife and me and my wife, and I think I must have passed some kind of invisible litmus test, because the next thing I knew there were emails and telephone calls and letters flying backwards and forwards, and hey presto, those doors behind which the Chinese police had hitherto rested in anonymity were suddenly open to me, the first Western writer to gain that kind of access, all thanks to Dr. Ward. And so I went there and I researched that first book. That first book rolled into a second and a third and a fourth, and I ended up writing 6 books. I made many friends there. I developed a rapport and relationship with the Chinese police, which I don't think anybody else in the West has done. And also met a lot of Chinese crime writers. Such was the relationship that developed that I ended up being made an honorary member of the Beijing chapter of the Chinese Crime Writers Association, the only Western writer to receive this honour. And it's something I cherish to this day. But when I'm in a place researching it, I take my precious digital video camera and I take pictures of everything. It's great because you have sound, which gives you atmosphere. You have the pictures that help the recollection. I can do interviews with people. And usually at the end of a book, as a kind of memento of the whole experience, I cut together a little 4 or 5 minute film set to music of images taken during the research. So I'd like to show you some of those images today, just a short film. I think it's just about 4.5 minutes long, which will lead you into my China experience.